Hi, I'm God. I'm God. Now I know what you're thinking. Another straight white male who thinks he's God. It's not that at all. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what it's like to be God. You don't hear my perspective very often.
All right, God.
And I have to tell you, it's not that easy being the one and only almighty creator. But I'll tell you something. I've learned a lot over the years. Much like you, I often learn the hard way. Look at Adam, the first human. I created Adam with opposable thumbs, a complex brain, with the ability to experience ecstasy and all kinds of bells and whistles. But still, he was lonely. Why didn't I think of that? So I separated the first human into male and female, and that's when it really started getting interesting. Now, if you're a parent, you know what it's like to have offspring. I gave them only one rule that they had to follow. But I threatened them with a consequence that was too big. Have you ever done that? And then I didn't follow through. What a mistake. I told them, if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will die. And what did they do? They did what every kid does. They tested me. They ate from the tree. And what was I supposed to do? Kill them? Oy vey. So
All right, God.
So I backed down. Now I know you parent educators and counselors out there are thinking, come on, God. Consistency and follow through are basic parenting 101. Everybody knows that. Because if the consequences are constantly changing, then children never know what to expect, and it creates all kinds of problems. But they don't provide a manual to being God. So I've been learning as I go. Instead of killing my new creations, I reduced the sentence to kicking them out of the Garden of Eden, and then pain in childbirth for all women for all time. Now, I realize now that even that may have been a bit of an overreaction. Because when you think about it, at the time, Adam and Eve had no knowledge of good and evil. So I ended up punishing all women for all time for a mistake made by one woman who didn't even know the difference between good and evil. Not exactly fair. But I was a novice back then. Of course, my second attempt wasn't a whole lot better. When Cain, the first offspring of Adam and Eve, killed his brother Abel, I basically let Cain off the hook for murder. Now, you can't blame me though. I mean, I was feeling terribly responsible for the moral confusion that I had created after my missteps in the Garden of Eden. So, in my attempt to not overdo it again, I was a little soft on Cain. And I probably reinforced the sense of arbitrariness when it comes to punishment and consequences. So that by the time we got to Noah's generation, oh my God, humanity was a total mess. People were mean, corrupt, backbiting, dishonest. And I guess I have to take some of the blame for all this since I created them and, well, I hadn't been a very good role model as a parent. Humankind had become so detestable to me at that point that all I could think of was to wipe the slate clean and start over. So I decided to flood the entire world, kill all the animals and the people. Honestly, it was probably another one of my overreactions. For one thing, the animals hadn't really done anything wrong. When it was all over, I looked around at the carnage and the corpses, the bloated children's corpses, floating in the water and holding on for dear life to their bloated mothers. Corpses. And all the little bunny rabbits and the dead horses. These were the hardest for me to face. And the elephants, I mean, they're so cute, and they just kept swimming and swimming and swimming as long as they could until they got so tired, and then they just started dropping one by one to their death. It was awful. It was awful. And I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. And so that this time I repented, and I promised that I would never do anything like that again. This was a big step for me. Big step for me. I made a conscious decision to change the way I related to humanity. It meant that I had to change the way I wielded my power. In the Garden of Eden, I set the rules like a dictator or like a king. If I wanted to change the rules, I changed the rules. I didn't worry about consistency. I mean, who was I responsible to? Nobody. I could do whatever I wanted. Heck, I'm God. It was my way or the highway. That's how I could literally let Cain get away with murder. But after the flood, I looked at myself in the mirror and said, okay, big one, so you're the all-powerful ruler of the world. How's that working for you? And how's that working for your creation? And I had to admit it. It was probably not the best way to create a just society on earth. And so I decided to make a promise and to enter into a covenant with Noah and with all of humanity. Now, I know that you here at All Souls know about covenants. That's how you organize your church, and you just spent a month on the theme of covenants before you got onto the theme of God. But at the time of the flood, this was new to me, new to everyone, to enter relationships with others in which there are expectations and a willingness to have a give and take. Suddenly I realized that if I was going to get this creation thing right, I would need to share my power with humanity. It took some soul searching on my part as the most powerful being of all time to freely enter into a covenant which bound me to certain actions that I promised to take or not take depending on your actions. But I realized that instead of continuing down the path which said to humanity, I am the most powerful being and I do it my way, I was going to say, even though I'm the most powerful being and I can do as I please, when I please, to whomever I please, I will be in a covenantal relationship with you and I will follow through on the promises that I make to you. Now that's when I learned that I could be a better God. If instead of dictating laws, I became a partner with humanity in changing to make the world more just. Now, I may have still been learning at this point, but I knew that such an arrangement had its risks. I knew that relinquishing some amount of my power and control would cause me to have to defer to some human ideas about right and wrong. I learned pretty quickly that covenants do not always lead to ideal outcomes. But I found that there's still a better way to manage power in relationships if the goal of those relationships is to create justice and goodness. Now, as you know, covenants are the moral and spiritual roots of democracy. Covenants require individuals to bind their lives together with certain rights and certain obligations for the common good. And even I know that democracy is imperfect. As Winston Churchill once said, democracy is the worst system of government ever invented, except for all the others. Needless to say, it was very different for me to be in a covenantal relationship with my creation. But at that point, I'm going to tell you, I would try would have tried anything. To see how it went, let's just look back at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah for a minute. You know, in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 18, which, by the way, is a story about the sin of inhospitality. Just to clear that up, it has nothing to do with homosexuality, but that's another sermon. I'll come back for that another time. What I want to talk about that story today is about how being in these relationships with humanity caused me to have to negotiate with humanity. In this case, Abraham. In fact, you can see in that story how I was persuaded by the morality of Abraham. I was becoming a God who was willing to learn from my own creation. Well, sort of. If you remember the story in the Bible, chapter 18 of Genesis, starting around verse 23, I was ready and prepared to rain down fire on Sodom and destroy the city and all its inhabitants. And Abraham said, "Wait a minute, God. Will you really sweep away the innocents along with the guilty? Perhaps there are 50 innocent people in the city. Will you sweep it away anyway? Heaven forbid that you do a thing like that, to deal death to the innocent along with the guilty? The judge of all earth, will he not do what is just?" I was floored. The way he was talking to me, the way he was looking at me. What had I done to my offspring were now lecturing me? But what could I do at that point? So I said, okay. If I find 50 within the city who are innocent, I will bear with the whole place for their sake. And then Abraham spoke up again. Perhaps of the 50 innocent people, there are 5. Only 5 lacking. Will you bring ruin upon the whole city because of 5? And I had to admit, that's a fair point. So I told him, okay. I will not bring ruin on the city if I find there 45. And then Abraham, with all his chutzpah, continued to negotiate with me until I finally agreed that if I found just 10 innocent people in Sodom, I would spare the entire city. Abraham, he was a tough negotiator. But more than that, he was right. And at the time of Noah, I had destroyed everything and everyone indiscriminately. At this point, going forward, I knew that I had to be more circumspect. Listening to Abraham was helping me to figure out how to do a better job. But in the end, I destroyed the whole lot of them anyway in Sodom because I couldn't find even 10 innocent adults. But I regretted killing all those children and animals who were really not responsible. I mean, those burnt little fingers, the charred paws and claws and fur. So I continued to learn the hard way. I told Lot's wife that if she turned around, I was to look back at the city, I was going to turn her into a pillar of salt. I probably shouldn't have threatened that consequence either, because of course she did it, and then I had learned by then that I needed to follow through if I made a threat, so I turned her to salt. I have to admit, following through on a bad decision didn't feel very good either. But at least I was being consistent, right? Anyway, like I said, it's tough to know what to do sometimes, even for me. But I was making progress. When it came to my servant Job, as you can see in the book of Job in the Bible, this is when I realized I had to take my education to a whole new level. In short, Job was a very good man. In fact, he was the most obedient, loving, honest, and devout person of his generation. And when Satan came to me and he made me a bet that he could get Job to denounce me, I couldn't help but take the wager. Satan made a good point that since I continually blessed Job for his obedience, of course Job would be devoted to me. But if I were to stop blessing him, he would probably turn on me in just a minute, Satan said. Satan made it sound like I was running some kind of moral welfare system. So I wanted to prove him wrong. So I let Satan do what he wanted to. As long as he didn't kill Job, I let him kill all of Job's children. And to inflict Job with terrible sores all over his body till he couldn't stand it. Job suffered incredibly under Satan's test. Even as I talk about it now, I ask myself, how could I have let him kill all of those lovely children? But I'd made a bet, and I had to follow through. Remarkably, despite it all, Job continued to believe in me and look to me. After a while, he began to question me about my morality. He asked me how I could possibly allow such tragedy to befall him and his family when he had done nothing wrong. He had been faithful all his life. He asked me to tell him how. Just tell me how I offended you. Just tell me how I have sinned before you, and I will repent. I will make amends. But I had no answer since he had done nothing wrong. He looked at me with the eyes of a father who had lost his children. And he said, just give me a reason. Give me a reason so that I know that I haven't just been used. But I had no answer, for I had used him. I allowed a good and righteous man to suffer the greatest agonies of life. And worst of all, it was unjust. Suddenly, in the light of Job's questions, I felt like I was on trial. What gave him the right to question God? But I knew the answer. It was a right conferred by love. He loved me. He kept his side of the covenant. And I had broken mine. And yet he still loved me. For the first time, I felt like human beings were morally superior to me. I felt as if they knew something and understood something that I could never really know. When I gave Job a whole nother family and I restored him to perfect health, he was grateful, of course, but the new children couldn't replace the old. There would always be an ache in his soul for those he had loved and lost. There are some things that not even God can rectify. There are some pains that not even God can relieve. As I watched Job, I could not help but see that he had become my teacher. I could not help but notice that there is something he had that I could never have. Somehow, the human experience of finitude and mortality, somehow human beings knowing full well that they are going to die, and all those who they love are going to die too, and yet still they hope and they help and they love. What did I know about that? What could I know about that? It was something that an eternal, deathless, all-powerful creator could never comprehend. What could I know about mortality and how to get through it? In the glare of that realization, I knew that unless I could become human, I would never fully understand how to be God. I had found the limitation within my limitlessness. The only way I was going to overcome this limitation was to come down to earth and become fully human. And so I decided to leave heaven and be born on earth through a little babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, just like all babies everywhere. I decided to face the trials and the troubles and the traumas that every human being faces. It meant I had to be born into a poor family in a small village in humble circumstances. Then I would really know the truth about what life is like down here. I had to endure sacrifice, ridicule, doubts, fear, friendship, betrayal, anguish, love, and death. Then, and only then, could I finally be a compassionate and understanding God. As Christmas approaches again this year, and you once again hear the story of God coming to earth as a little baby, might you marvel at the human conception of a God who is willing to become small and less powerful in order to learn and grow. Might you even try to emulate the idea of a God who is willing to sacrifice and reflect and feel pain in order to understand a bigger truth, not just his truth, but a universal truth beyond any one understanding. Because speaking as God, I have to tell you, it was only after coming down to earth that I finally understood what love is. Love demands sharing power. And love demands being able to walk in someone else's shoes. Why? Because there are certain things one can never know unless we do. In fact, love demands that we not only feed the hungry and clothe the naked and free the oppressed, but that we also go out of our way to get to know the hungry and get to know the naked and get to know the oppressed. Because we realize that they know something about life and about love that we do not know and that we cannot know without one another. I realize that most people listening to what I've been saying this morning will think this story is less about the education of God and more about the human education about God. And so if you consider this not so much a story about God learning to be God, but more a chronicle of human beings learning who God is and what God is, then you might imagine that in that last stage called incarnation, when God finally leaves the heavens and comes down to earth, it's not so much that God left the sky, but that humans eventually began to realize that what is godly is not up there in the heavens somewhere, but is found right here in flesh and blood and bones on earth. That God now sees through human eyes and functions through human actions. And that the salvation of the earth and humankind now relies on our choices. Today we can understand that with each child who's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe. And that the place to look for what is holy is right here, right now on earth. Christmas time is approaching. It's the story of God finally coming down to earth. You and I must tell the world this good news. Could it be that we are the heralds of a new age? And that God is finally, after all these years, coming down to earth? On a personal note, speaking as Marlin, I just want to say that I love this God of incarnation. I am called by this God of the flesh that walks and talks, this God of love, to not just feed the hungry and clothe the naked and free the oppressed, but to understand these fellow travelers as my brothers and my sisters and my teachers. Because they know so much about life that I do not yet understand. In that way, I pray, let me be an instrument of thy will, O God. Amen.